Hello and welcome to Fresh Take from What Fresh Hell, Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy. Today we're talking to Dr. Daniel Siegel. He is the founding co-director of the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center and the executive director of the Mind Sight Institute, which fosters insight, empathy, and integration. With numerous bestsellers, including The Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline, both co-authored with Tina Payne Bryson, and a professional series of textbooks, Dr. Siegel is a leading voice in interpersonal neurobiology, shaping minds worldwide with both wisdom and compassion. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Margaret. Thanks for having me.
So we all want our kids, everybody listening to this podcast wants our kids to grow up and thrive and be the people they are meant to be. But day by day, we're not so much thriving as surviving. We're just getting by. We're just managing to do everything we need to do in a day. And we are left feeling that that's not nearly enough for our kids. And you tell us in this book that we might be getting that wrong.
Yeah, the exciting thing about looking at the way that science can inform parenting is that we as parents actually can help our children develop resilience, develop a capacity for joy, develop an ability to really connect with each other, even in the face of the pandemic, in the face of all the troubles in our world. Parents have this incredible opportunity to actually develop these skills in their children. So it's more than just surviving. It is, a wonderful flourishing, a thriving that when Tina and I write our books or when I write my own parenting books, it's taking the science and making it very practical. And the science is a very positive message about what we can do as parents.
We're big on science and practicality on this podcast.
That's right.
So let's start with the whole brain perspective. And what does that phrase mean?
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I work in an area called interpersonal neurobiology, and parents don't need to know what that's all about, except to say that,
Phew.
I'm the editor of a series. I've edited now over 100 textbooks for professionals. So if you do want to get into it, there's a lot of reading you can do. But what I try to do is summarize all that exciting synthesis of science into useful packets for parents to actually use or psychotherapists to use in really helping people grow. So you might not think about it this way, but a parent is really the first teacher of a child. And even the term discipline means actually to teach, not to punish. So we are this source of deep learning for our kids. And, as mammals, we're very relational creatures. And, kids learn from us how to survive in the world. So I was recently with my son, who's 35 now, Alex Siegel, wonderful musician. We were going to celebrate each other's birthdays at the Long Beach Aquarium. And, we learned that, otters, as an example of mammals, they teach their babies how to survive in the world, right? And those teaching opportunities can be summarized very simply as how you develop this process called integration. And integration is where different aspects like your left and right leg or like the upper and lower parts of your brain or two people in a relationship can be different in a relational system, how you allow those differences to be honored and then promote really compassionate connecting linkages. And when you balance those two things being different on the one hand and things being linked on the other, it's a process called integration. So the summary of thousands of, scientific studies say that integration is the basis of well-being. And when you as a parent learn to cultivate integration, you learn to develop well-being and resilience in your child. So I wanted to use the word integration. I use it all the time in my science books, but it felt much more accessible for parents to use the term whole brain, which means an integrated brain, which sounds a little overwhelming, integrated brain, but whole brain says, yeah, I can really relate to that. So whether you talk about whole mind or whole brain or whole living, that word whole is actually a subtitle of my next book for therapists, to look at wholeness in therapy. But what you can do is learn the techniques on how you as a parent can actually cultivate integration in the way you communicate. And amazingly, how you communicate with your child actually stimulates the growth of integration in the child's brain. And studies have shown that the more integrated your brain, the more well-being you have. It's that simple.
So, integration of the brain largely involves, I think, having read this book, the left and right sides of the brain, which, again, anybody who's listened to a few episodes of this podcast or took psychology in college knows about left brain, right brain, kind of understand these two halves that together create a whole. But can you break down for us a little more clearly what is left brain, what is right brain, why do we need
Absolutely.
both?
Well, Amy, and just for those who may have had a background, in the work I do kind of in this field of interpersonal neurobiology, we talk about 9 ways you integrate the brain. So when Tina was a student of mine, and then she became a colleague, and we became co-authors. So in the whole brain child, we took those 9 domains and we said, 9 is a big number. Let's kind of bring it down to 5. So we kind of consolidated a couple of them into groupings, but there are really 9 ways you can really parse out integration. One of the 9 is bilateral. That is looking at left and right.
Okay.
And what we may have learned years ago about the left and right, in some ways was oversimplified. Like people would say, oh, the right is creative and the left is intellectual. It's not that simple.
And that's the airport book version, like Mars and Venus or whatever.
Yeah,
right.
And it's just wrong. So the way to think about it is, and we described this in the book, but in the textbook, The Developing Mind, I write a graduate school textbook. I think it's revised every 10 years or so. I had tried to be really careful and up to date on the science. So the way to think about it is this: the right has a broad focus of attention. The left has a more narrow focus of attention. And when you start with that, everything kind of unfolds. The right is very much woven into the input from the body. And because emotions start in the body, raw emotion starts in the right hemisphere. And so that means that the right is given the challenge of how to regulate the internal state of the body. So what your heart is feeling, what your lungs are feeling, what your intestines are feeling, that all goes up to the right hemisphere. So the right is where you get a sense of the interior of the body, called interoception. The right is actually where we feel raw emotions most robustly. The right is the side of the brain that actually almost exclusively has autobiographical memory. So your sense of self and time. And the right communicates non-verbally. So with eye contact, there's 7 nonverbal signals: eye contact, facial expression, the tone of voice you bring, your posture, the gestures you make, the timing, and the intensity of responses. Those 7 things are worth memorizing, because your right hemisphere, for most of us, doesn't have language to speak. But it is actually a majority of our communication is the nonverbal part, the nonverbal parts. I can say that in different ways with my tone of voice. And so when you learn that, you go, wow. So the right has autobiographical, it's the sense of the body, it's very relational, and it's communicating with all this nonverbal stuff. But in school, we learn a lot of the left hemisphere stuff. So luckily in English, many of the features of the left hemisphere, in contrast to the right, are beginning with an L. But the first one we said is a narrower focus of attention. What that means is the left is very much interested in detail rather than the broad picture that the right hemisphere is focusing on. The left looks at the detail. So that means it makes lists. It means it's logical, looking for cause-effect relationships. Why did A go to B, go to C? So it's very linear, and it has linguistics, all those L's.
Mm.
are the way to remember it. So it speaks a lot, it talks a lot. And if you're only speaking as a parent from your left hemisphere and you have a little 1-year-old at home, because the left hemisphere develops later, that's another L. The right is dominant in the first 18 months of life. So if you're like a big left dominant person because of the schooling we get, emphasize that, you're not going to know how to relate to this little infant,
Mhm.
right? It's all nonverbal. So you need in yourself as a parent, and when I wrote with Mary Hartzell the book Parenting from the Inside Out, we really focused on this, that you as a parent can go inside and understand how your own parenting affected you. But part of that is to know, if you leaned over to the left, as 20% of us do, because it was too painful, the emotional disconnection, you're not going to actually have developed the skills that you need to be with an infant. That doesn't mean it's over, because the brain is always open to changing. So part of the left right business then, and Amy, this is probably longer than
No,
you
no, it's
wanted
very
us to.
Oh,
interesting.
Amy's lit up by this. She's like,
Okay.
she could do this all day.
My
So
left
when
brain
you
loves this.
take in this domain, right? I'm glad you're lit up by it, because it's super, super useful as well as exciting. You know, what happens then is you go, well, I need to bring my right hemisphere as a mom, as a dad, into my interaction now, because, and one of my patients, my first patients, said this the best way I've ever heard anyone say it. The key to relational healing, really, and relational joining is to feel felt. That's the phrase she came up with.
Mm.
And feeling felt is what happens when you bring your right hemisphere into communication with your child, and then the child feels like they're not alone anymore. So often the right hemisphere is left out of the situation, and a parent comes with a lot of words. You should do this, and this is what I'm thinking, and didn't you remember that? And why wasn't it like this? And blah, blah, blah. You know, and some of that can be important later on,
Mm.
but in a first encounter with a kid, with anybody really, you've got to really join at the level of the right hemisphere.
Mm.
And this joining gives the child, and you too, the experience of feeling felt. So instead of being a separate person, you become not only who you are individually, you become a part of a we. And
Mm.
that's the key to whole brain parenting. And we start with the left and right because, so many parents have gone through a school system, and they can think and talk and come up with logical things to say and focus on the narrow issue, and they miss the big picture. So essentially, whole brain parenting is saying, as a starting place for left and right, you know, bring your left in, that's fine. No one's saying get rid of it, but let's build your right hemisphere skills so that you know how to just be in a right hemisphere alignment with another person, and then do the doing of the left hemisphere's words. But that being and doing is another way of kind of feeling into, in some ways, what are the um, polarities, like left and right, what's being and doing, all these things you want to bring to the whole brain experience as you bring in all these things.
We are talking to Dr. Daniel Siegel, and I have a question about left and right hemispheres I'm going to ask right after this break. So I feel like another term that we hear thrown around, I'm right brained, he's left brained. Are people naturally more better at coming from one or the other sides of their brains?
People use terms like that's a left brain person, a right brain person, and someone did a study of that and shows it's never true.
Hmm.
And so I've tried my best to not use that way of speaking.
Hmm.
But what you can say is that some people tend to lean left or lean right, or in a particular moment, you're more engaging the networks of your left hemisphere or your right hemisphere. So one way I try to then use that from a scientific point of view is use the word mode, MODE. So we all have all the modes available to us, and we may tend to rely on the left mode more than the right mode. So that way you can avoid people who will attack you and say, research has shown there's no such thing as a left brain person or right brain person, which is true. It's shown that. But we do have these different modes we tend to lean into and draw upon. And certainly in situations, I'll give you an example. you know, um, I mean, this is a sad example, really sad example, but when I was in medical school, before I dropped out and then ultimately came back, I was mostly a left mode leaning guy. I
Mhm.
got through. My family was very confusing, and I think it was a way of withdrawing into a place where I didn't feel my body. I wasn't aware of my autobiographical sense of self. Raw emotion was far from my experience, and relationships, were not in kind of the priority world of my life. Anyway, so it was good for being a science student, but not so good for, I think, being a friend or
Mhm.
whatever. And so when I went to medical school, my old girlfriend, sadly, her mom was very ill, and she called me up to tell me. And instead of really tuning into her with my right hemisphere, I would say now, and just feeling her pain and being with her and bearing witness to this really painful moment in her life. And, we had been boyfriend and girlfriend and really good friends. I went into this left mode where I didn't feel anything, diagnostic dump on her as a
Mhm.
first year medical student and what I knew about pathology and blah, blah,
Right.
blah, blah, blah. And she hung up the phone on me,
Mm.
Mm,
as she should have.
Mhm.
So her right hemisphere just needed to feel felt by her old boyfriend
Mm.
who happened to be in medical school. And
Right.
instead, because I loved her mom, it was so upsetting to think of this wonderful woman becoming ill that, I just went to the number, that's not a word, is it? The less feeling full, if emotions are on
Mhm.
both sides of the brain, but I wouldn't have the raw emotion of the right if I could just go into the land of the left.
That's a really useful example. I feel like it makes it really, really clear.
Yeah.
So one of the strategies that you talk about in the book, which I think is just this, with children, is that we should connect and redirect, and we tend
Yeah.
to, I think, do just the redirect part, right? That
Mm.
your child will fall. This is one of the examples in the book. Your child falls, skins their knee. We think we are supposed to fill that space with a lot of words and a lot of "now you're fine, now you don't cry because you're a big boy, and now let's go over here and you're going to color." But we skip the connecting first. So it seems to me,
Exactly.
right, when you're talking to a friend, you might not always understand that the connection is what they're seeking. With our child, hopefully that can sink in maybe a little more quickly, that we do have to start there with the connection part.
Yeah. And, Tina and I came up with that phrase, connect before you redirect, to try, as we do throughout the whole book, Whole Brain Child, to try to really remind people that these are memorable and very easily actionable ways you can do this. Now, um, let's take this example of the kids falling down with the knee, and it in many ways it's parallel. The emotional reality is parallel to when my ex-girlfriend called me, with
Mhm.
the sad news. So I have to be able to hold the news that she has. As a parent, if my kid falls and hurts their knee and they're really screaming in pain, I need to be able to hold the experience that I love this kid more than anything. I'm their parent, right? And they're in pain. So, number one, I'm going to feel their pain because I have this set of neurons called mirror neurons, which are really more like sponge neurons, where I sponge in my child's pain. So, I'm feeling the pain. Then I have the incredible feeling of helplessness. Like I didn't prevent my child from falling, or just
Oh.
life happens. And now this terrible thing happened. What other terrible things are going to happen? So I have to be aware of my vulnerability and my child's vulnerability and the helplessness that I can feel. So to avoid all of those feelings, feeling the pain, feeling the helplessness, I just go and say, you should have blah, blah, blah. And I start saying a bunch of things. So we want to be kind to our inner lives and say, yeah, of course, it's really hard to feel helpless. It's really hard to feel vulnerable. It's really hard to feel the uncertainty of life. I mean, I remember once we were with my son, when he was like, I think 3 or 4 or something like that. So he had two grandmothers with him. He had me, he had his mom, he had someone else there caring for him. There were 5, 6 of us all around him. And we were at the ocean at a park overlooking the ocean. He gets up on this, fence overlooking the ocean. We're all gathered around him. We're taking pictures. And he slips and breaks off his 2 front teeth.
Oh.
they were baby teeth, fortunately.
Thank
Those mirror
goodness.
neurons are firing
Oh,
for me
I
right
know.
Yeah.
I'm already like,
And I take a deep breath and I go, oh my God, life is so vulnerable. You got every
Mhm.
caregiver you can imagine for this kid, and just a slip,
Oh,
and this thing happens,
Boom.
and anyway, sorry about that, but you can feel even with that
We
example,
had it. I was going to say that's a very good example. Everyone's like, my spongy neurons right now
you're
are lit up.
sponging them up, right? You sponge it up. So part of this journey, and that's why I don't think Tina and I would have written any of the 4 books we wrote had not had I hadn't written already, with Mary Hartzell, Parenting from the Inside Out, because
Mhm.
the Inside Out approach is basically saying, the real superpower we have as parents. And this is what, when I became an attachment researcher, so drew me to that field of science. The real power we have is to go inward and realize, by making sense of our own childhood experiences and making sense of how our own mind works. Like in this case, wow, my kid falls, she hurts her knee, and I'm busy telling her, oh, next time you should do this and do that. It's my own vulnerability,
Mhm.
and then sponging in her vulnerability and her pain, that's getting me to actually do a parenting move that's really not good for my child. Even though I can understand, okay, I did it because I didn't want to feel the pain of vulnerability and helplessness and all that stuff. But I need to do the inner work, right?
Mhm.
And this is why when Mary and I put the manuscript together for Parenting from the Inside Out, we finished it and we turned it into 24 publishers, all turned it down.
Mm.
And they said the American public doesn't want you to have the parenting population go inside. They want you to tell them what's wrong with their kid and fix their kid.
Right.
And we said, but the research shows you've got to go inside to really actually make sense of your own childhood, so
Mhm.
you can be vulnerable and you can connect before you redirect. And all those things we say, they're really hard to do unless you've done this. Basically, it's taking a stance saying, I'm a human being. I've had my own experience, and I'm parenting now this young child, but I was once a young child too. So
Mm.
let me see how it was for me to be a young kid and how that affected me.
I have a question about integration, dealing with kids who maybe or selves who maybe have a harder time with integration. I'm assuming kids on the spectrum, like they have, I know, problems with actual bilateral movement. I know a kid, one of my kids on the spectrum, literally struggles with anything bilateral. Their integration is maybe more challenging than a typically developing kid. Is there research around how kids with neurodiversity, do they have more trouble accessing integration, or parents with their own neurodiversity? Are there people who have more struggles with this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Margaret. And just to really start with um, acknowledging that we all have different kinds of brains,
Mm-hmm.
and so I love the idea of talking about neurodiversity rather than
Mm-hmm.
being like an illness or something like that.
Right.
Um, and at the same time, I, I was once invited to be like a panel discussionist, or whatever you call it. So I was on a panel with some people who were neurodiverse, who were a part of a drama group, and we were just about to go see this incredible play called "The Curious Incident of the Dog in the
Oh
Nighttime,"
yeah, yeah, I saw it.
right?
Great
About
book too.
an adolescent boy with autism, right? And so we had this conversation, and I walked them through one way of thinking about integration and neuroatypical development. And so I'll say to you what I said to them, and the group in the audience, was this: that when there's integration, there's a sense of harmony.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about a river, think about a flow of a river that's in harmony, and one bank of the river is chaos. So when you're outside the river, it's chaos. The other bank of the river is rigidity.
Mm.
And so when we talk about integration, we're talking about this flow of harmony, and it has 5 features that spell the word faces, but it's flexible, that's F, it's adaptive, that's A, It's coherent, which has a sense of groundedness and resilience. That's C. It's energized, like a sense of vitality. That's E. And the S of faces is stable, meaning it's reliable, not that it's rigid, but that you can rely on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when there's challenges to integration, people tend to go to chaos or rigidity or both,
Right.
right? So what I said to these folks, and it's just true across a lot of different challenges we have. When someone's life is filled with chaos and rigidity, you can pretty much guess and predict accurately that there's somewhere where integration is being challenged or impaired. And so with the neuro atypicality that's known as being on the spectrum or autism, the first layer of that is called sensory integration.
Mm-hmm.
And sensory integration is, where we have the five senses, right? Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. We're bringing energy flow from outside the body. In a neurotypical way, we usually sort it out and figure out which, sense are we going to focus on. And if you're let's say take in sound, you can take in sound and screen out the sounds you don't want to pay attention to and really focus on the ones you do. So you're differentiating and linking. So that's the definition of integration. So sensory integration means, within a given sense, like sound, I can differentiate different aspects of the sounds that are coming in and paying attention to the ones that are important and get rid of the ones that are not important. And that's how I can listen carefully to what's being said and not be flooded by the sound of an air conditioner or some dog barking in the distance or something, and you can go through all the senses like that. With sensory integration challenges, there's a neuroatypical development so that the sensory apparatus doesn't allow you to integrate, doesn't allow you to sort through. And so there's either a shutting down in rigidity or a flooding in chaos, right? So if we just start there, the person's life is challenged. So they're going to need to have different physical conditions, less sound, less extreme lights, smells that are there, the way the body is being touched, right? And, the foods that are eaten. All those can flood a person and lead to chaos or rigidity. So you start there, and then the people on the panel said, yeah, and one particular guy said, yeah, that's my whole life. I said, well, when you're in chaos or rigidity, the next layer of integration that's challenged is emotions, because you get flooded with emotions. And so anytime you use a phrase like balanced emotions or emotion regulation, it's coming from integration. So integration allows regulation, basically.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So now if you're on the neuroatypical life course, then your emotions are going to flood you, and they'll either shut you down in rigidity or flood you with chaos. So then you go, okay, well, wow, now I've got two challenges. Well, then unfortunately, there's a third layer of challenge, which is social integration. That is, we're very social creatures. And my research advisor, Marion Sigmund, she was able to show that kids on the spectrum, we didn't use that term then, but kids with autism have a normal need for attachment and relatedness. Because of their sensory integration challenges and emotion regulation challenges, it expresses itself in an atypical way. But that network for needing relational connection is perfectly intact.
Still there, huh?
It's still there. But because that's one of the most intensely emotionally arousing things,
Right.
you avoid it.
Yes.
Because it floods you. So you're just doing it to try to survive, So now we have a third layer where the brain needs to learn social interactive skills. And those skills then aren't being learned because of the emotion dysregulation, because of the sensory integration. So now you have those three layers of integration that are all being challenged. And because of that, just to survive, a kid withdraws. And the word autism even comes from auto, meaning self, individual. You withdraw into your individual life.
Yeah.
And you don't develop the skills. So, in working then at those 3 layers of integration challenge for people on the spectrum of neuroatypical development, you really want to support them in allowing them to develop the social skills that they really want to develop
Mm-hmm.
by allowing them to learn about their emotions and have their emotions not be flooding them or shutting them down. And part of that has to do with realizing that the sensory integration level is the deepest level in some senses. So you want to allow the conditions to not flood them as best you can.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the work of Steve Porges for kids who are audio sensitive, showed that if you screen out some of the lower pitched sound like that are leading to a sense of terror, those kids become very social just by wearing headphones that
Mm-hmm.
screen out certain low pitched sounds. So there's different things to do, but working with your own child, Margaret, would be, seeing how this particular child's, way that they're developing, how she or he or they need certain things to change to become more available to learn and grow.
Even just breaking down the steps of that makes it feel less challenging.
Absolutely. We're talking to Dr. Daniel Siegel. His book is The Whole Brain Child, and we'll be right back with even more. Dr. Siegel, this makes so much sense. I'm understanding things about my own brain and the people of those closest to me in new ways. I wanted to talk to you about how even young children can be sort of walked into this conversation, that this isn't really about us carefully pulling the strings of their social and emotional development without them realizing it, that actually even young kids can understand this. Tell us about how we can start that conversation.
Yeah, well, it's so fun to talk to you too about this because these are conversations, and even the word conversation is such a cool word. Con means it is from the term with, and verse is to turn. So we want to turn with each other our attention to certain things, and it is a conversation. So, I had a student who became also a co-author of mine, Dina Margolin, and we wrote 2 books. One is called Now Maps, and then well, actually, we wrote that book. And then from that book, I wrote Now Maps Junior for really little kids.
Mm.
And basically, what these books allow you to do is they allow you to join with a child in conversation. The Now Maps is for tweens, between like 8 and 12. The Now Maps Junior is for preschool kids, but it allows them to look at how their own emotional life works, how to develop this reflective capacity, I call it mind sight, to see their mind and then therefore be able to know the mind of other people. And
Mm.
so whatever a person's challenges might be, and just being alive on this planet is a challenge. I'll just say
Big
that.
one. Yep.
It's a big one. So we're all in a journey towards wholeness. That this next book I wrote for therapists is, basically saying the whole life journey is a journey to try to get to wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And we do it in very different ways, depending on our temperament and our experiences and how those combine. So we could talk about that later. But just to say that, as a parent, what you do is you have this wonderful opportunity to say, who is this child in front of me?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever expectations I have of who they should be, my task is to let those expectations not restrict my ability to actually see who my child is. And sometimes we have to let go of those expectations. Like, if I want my son to be a big football player, but they'd rather be, drawing, become a painter, an artist, I've got to see my child for who they are,
Mm-hmm.
and be open to how your child can become the best them that they can be. And that's a part of the challenge. And I think integration is a great, not only scientifically valid view, but it's a great practical tool for parents to have. I remember once I was taking care of a family and I was going away on a long vacation. And I said, okay, I've got to give you the secret sauce because I'm going to be away for 3 weeks and you're really in a tough spot. The secret sauce is integration. They go, what do you mean? I go, whenever you have chaos or rigidity in your family, take a breath and say, what's not being integrated here? And start with the relational world. Are you seeing the inner life of your child as openly as you could?
Hmm.
And if you're not, you're going to be trying to shove your expectations onto your child. And there's going to be either a shutting down in rigidity or a blowing up in chaos. And whether you call it a tantrum or a meltdown or flipping your lid, whatever you want to call it, it's a moment of impaired integration. So I said, I'm going to be away. I just want you to watch for chaos and rigidity. That's the only thing I'm asking you to do. And then if you sense chaos or rigidity in your family, you need to pause, stop whatever you're doing, and ask yourself the question, where is differentiation not being honored, things being different, people being allowed to be uniquely who they are? And then where's linkage not happening? How do we communicate with compassionate, respectful connection? And when I came back weeks later, they called me up. They said, we think we don't need to come in anymore. They gave us a secret sauce. And they were some friends of mine. I was at a holiday party and I said, how have you guys been? And they said, well, we're fine. Now
We're
we
all
know what to
set.
do. Yeah. So
We
it's
often
not
like to
always
say
that
we
easy.
solved it on the podcast. We're like, we solved it. Homework, we solved it. You solved it.
There you go. I mean, it's so funny, but this integration thing, and whether you call it whole brain living or whole brain child or whatever you want to call it, integration is really what it's about. And then when you teach people the empowering skills of that, like I hope whole brain child does, you as a parent then are, it's like the biblical story, you are taught the skill of fishing. You're not just given a fish, right? So that's my deepest hope for putting out all these parenting books, is not that people become like dependent on the book, but the book itself empowers a parent to have the skills. And Louis Pasteur, the wonderful scientist, had this great phrase: chance favors the prepared mind. So the reason I write all these books in general for therapists, but also for parents, is, I want the book to prepare the reader's mind, so they close the book when they're done reading it. They go out in the world, and the chance things that happen really are dealt with in this effective and even fun way, because you're seeing these moments of challenge as actually moments of opportunity to deepen states of integration. Right? Because you could, I mean, you can feel very burdened and say, oh my God, parenting is the hardest job in the world, which it is. And there's so much chaos and there's so much rigidity that happens, which it does. So you can look at the chaos and rigidity and go, oh my God, what a burden. This is such a hard job. Oh, this is terrible, terrible, terrible. Or you can have what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. And you can say, these moments of chaos and rigidity are invitations for further growth of integration. And then it changes your whole attitude. And Carol Dweck's beautiful studies on, what, and also Ellen Langer is another person in the same field where, in psychology, where your attitude changes everything. So if you say, okay, here's chaos and rigidity, great, an opportunity to deepen our learning and deepen our connection through integration.
I was just going to ask you about that just as we close, the kind of hopefulness, because I think for some of us, the enemy is this feeling of feeling stuck, that like, this is who we are, this is who our kids are, we're kind of in our corners, and we're all kind of, especially during the pandemic, locked together now, and it's all these different personalities. And this idea of brain plasticity, is plasticity a word? But like the ability, I think the hopefulness in the brain's ability to change, that doing this work is, we often say on the podcast, we don't do the work because it's work. It's because it is going to make things easier eventually, better eventually. And I think that this idea was very hopeful to me, that the brain can change, that like there is a plastic quality there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, a couple things. I wrote a book called Mindsight, and in that book, I talk about a a lot of people I work with, young people, middle-aged people, but one of the persons is in his mid-90s. Actually started at his early 90s. And I always use his case because Stuart is what I call him. He changed so much. His wife called me and said, did I give Stuart a brain transplant? And the reason he could change was because of exactly what you're saying, that um, science shows that this process called neuroplasticity. So it is a word, Margaret,
Okay.
plasticity, it's absolutely a word. Plasticity means how do you change in response to experience? And neuroplasticity is how the brain's structure and function can change across the lifespan, and so what Stewart's case reveals is that, if we figure out where the brain has not grown integration as well as it could have, then you can actually focus like a laser beam your attention. So there's a phrase I made up a while ago just to help remember this: where attention goes, neural firing flows and neural connection grows. So I could figure out what was likely not growing well in Stuart's brain that led him to have trouble with being aware of his emotions and, relating to his wife and all sorts of things. And you can read that in that chapter. But, what I did was not give Stuart brain surgery, but I knew that attention could stimulate the growth of fibers in his brain that had been waiting decades, almost a century to grow. And in his case, it was left and right hemisphere coordination, which he didn't have at all. And so there's a band of tissue called the corpus callosum, which connects the left and the right. So we could both grow what was going on in his right hemisphere, which had been underdeveloped, and likely grow these connecting fibers. So we were growing both differentiation, growing the areas that hadn't grown, and linkage. Those areas hadn't grown either. And he was like a different person, and you could feel it in the room. His wife could feel it in their relationship. And I certainly was incredibly honored to be on that journey with Stuart. And the idea of it is that when we know about neuroplasticity, it's an incredibly positive message.
Yeah.
When you add that to my field, attachment research, that shows that it isn't what happened to us that matters the most. It's how we make sense of what happened to us. And that sense-making process can happen at any age. That's what I did with Stuart. And that when you make sense, you're changing your brain and integrating your brain. So that's why I say, in terms of, whole brain child or parenting from the inside out or teaching kids to do this in Now Maps, all of these are just opportunities to grow your brain in a more integrated way at whatever age you are.
We have certainly grown our brains today on this interview with Dr. Daniel Siegel. Dr. Siegel's book that we were talking about today is The Whole Brain Child, but there is a long list of bestsellers and other work that you do, Dr. Siegel. Tell our listeners where they can find you and your work.
Probably the best place to go is just my website, which is DR for doctor, DR Dan, DAN, and then SIEGEL.com. And then there will be a bunch of things there. There are a bunch of videos you can watch. There are, books it'll refer you to if you want to get those. And then it'll link you to the Mindsight Institute if you want to take courses. That's the platform where we have the courses. But there's a lot of resources right there on drdansiegel.com. That's the best way to go.
Great. There will be a link there in the show notes for this episode, Dr. Siegel. This was a great conversation. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me. Thanks Amy.
Dan.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks, Dan.